I certainly agree with the sentiments of Rabbi Yamin, because when we first started out on this journey, certainly here in Lakewood, there's not a chance we would have had a room of people willing to come and listen and learn. Impossible. Just impossible. As a matter of fact, those of us, as everyone well knows, who went through this, like us, were terribly ashamed and did our best to hide from everybody because we couldn't deal with it. It was too embarrassing. We have come a long, long way. I created a handout that covers, in a certain comprehensive way, the sugya as I feel it's best to convey and learn and understand. It is not shaykh that we're going to go through all the slides, so please don't panic. It's not shaykh. There's no time. We need a week to be able to do proper due diligence on all the slides and explain everything. My purpose here is to give clarity in what is the sugya of crisis chinuch. Let's be very clear, this is not the regular sugya of chinuch habonim. We need something different if we're going to save our children. We all come to terms with the fact that doing regular chinuch interventions with children who are in crisis turns out to be a mazik, and we hurt them more. So what we've been developing over the years is an understanding of how can we bring them back? How can we help them? How can we help them reclaim happiness in their lives? How can we bring them back to us? To do that, it's crucial that we understand what exactly happened to these children. What is the issue? What is the problem they're struggling with? Because if we don't have a very sharp and clear tfisa, grasp, on what it is they're struggling with, well, then we're not going to be able to help them. It's not shaykh. We'll actually end up doing the wrong thing again and again and again. We will not get the results that we could get. So the purpose of this presentation is to very deeply take you into a place of understanding of what is kaching inside our kids, what's hurting them, what happened to them, so that we can then orchestrate interventions that are perfectly aligned with what the problem was in the first place in order to help them heal. I hope that makes sense. Without that understanding, we're not going to help them. We're just going to keep pushing off the problem, kicking it. As a matter of fact, in the early years here in Lakewood, when I was doing this work, what we discovered was that the more people pushed off allowing the kids to struggle and go off, the older they got before they finally rebelled and finally cracked and went off, the less likely it would be that we were going to help them. Actually, not that we would be a dime push them off when they're young, but the process of trying to protect them and overprotect and overprotect and overprotect and stop them expressing what's really kaching inside denies their own reality so profoundly that by the time they crack and they're much older, it's extremely, extremely difficult to get them to return and repair. It was very, very difficult and hard reality to come to terms with. But the reality is the earlier they express their problems and we allow them to express what's happening inside them, the more likely we are to be able to help them repair. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to go through these slides as best I can. Again, the goal, I think the morning part till lunchtime will be spent on trying to understand deeply what the problem is. And then we're going to go in the afternoon to how they react to it and what we can do as parents, teachers, mechanchim, community, all of us, collectively. What can we do to help them and how can we bring them back to us? So we have to understand what the problem is in order to understand how to repair it. So let's leave that alone. This is my mahalach. Now, a lot of people say what I'm going to be focusing on is kids who are in the most extreme cases of rebellion, in the most difficult matzavim. Obviously, there are many details of the mahalach that can be used for children who are not so extreme yet. But in the cases of children who are really severely in crisis, and that's, as we're going to see on this slide, for kids in this depth of struggle, there is only one mahalach that's going to bring them back, and that's the mahalach of crisis chinuch. So what we're looking at is kids brought up in a religious home who have at least 4 out of 6 of these criteria, and they almost always go together. And when we get children with 4 out of 6 of these, and I strongly recommend that at some point, I hope that we will have enough trained rabbanim for everybody to be able to have a rav you can speak to, so you can work out with your rav, are we in a matzav of Sofi B'kuch Nefesh? Because that's the sugya. We have to realize that once they end up in this very, very struggling, rebellious kind of state with drug use, it's not so much the Chilul Shabbos, because Chilul Shabbos alone doesn't mean Sofi B'kuch Nefesh. Doesn't mean that at all. A lot of the kids struggle with that on the way. But when you go through this whole group of syndromes together, you have at least 4 out of 6 of these. What we come to terms with is we're probably dealing with a Sofi B'kuch Nefesh, and it's crucial that you have your Rav, that you can speak it over with and come to terms with that. That this is not just like a little problem that's going to go away. This is a serious problem that demands and requires a different mahalach to deal with it. For any mental health professionals in the room and for parents, it's always kedai to rule out mental illness. My experience, I'll be honest with you, is it's extremely rare in these sugyas that we're looking at mental illness. Extremely rare. Even though if you'll go to secular psychologists who do not know anything about our culture and community, when they look at the symptoms or the struggles of our children, they will almost certainly want to tell us some sort of mental illness. It's quite common. It could happen, but I just want to be honest. While it's possible, it's extremely rare. It's extremely rare, and it's almost always the sugya of crisis chinuch, what's really happening to them, which is what we're going to explain. As I said before, you need das Torah. The things that are going to be required of you will to make, shall we say, exceptions in the normal mahalach of chinuch abonim, in the normal approach of any frum family to Torah mitzvahs. We're going to have to allow leniencies. We're going to have to allow and tolerate behavior that's outside the framework of Torah mitzvahs in order to save some of these kids. So we need das Torah here. It's crucial that people have a Rav that you can speak to who understands this sugya. And Baruch Hashem, more and more Rabbanim are becoming aware and trained and understanding of what the sugya is to help you with it. You need someone who understands the nuances, how complex this sugya is. You need someone experienced. And most of all, you need someone sensitive to you that's not going to blame you. When we first started this sugya, the very first article I ever wrote, which was in Jewish Observer, I think in 1989, I think it was that early, was a response. I responded together with a colleague of mine to a reference. They used to, do you remember Jewish Observer, anyone? You know, it was a magazine from the old days. But it had a little box. They used to bring out like a box to highlight, a gray box to highlight, you know, a specific point. And they highlighted an article on why kids are going off the derech. And the box said that the overwhelming consensus of Orthodox mental health professionals is that kids are going off the derech due to bad parenting. Now, we knew that wasn't true. As a matter of fact, my wife and I thought we were pretty decent parents, and we had the problem. So I knew it wasn't true, and I wrote back to the Jewish Observer, and their response was incredible. The overwhelming support that we got from the silent majority of parents who were suffering, thinking we're pretty decent parents. I don't know if we're that different to our neighbors. I don't know if we're that different to my sisters and my sisters-in-law and everybody else. I don't see it. We're not that crazy, so why is this happening to us? And the idea of that it's because of bad parenting puts the doggish completely in the wrong place, and we're going to address that. So you need someone sensitive to you that's not going to micromanage your life and try to look for details in you. Not that we don't all have details that we need to improve. We do. Let's be honest. None of us are perfect. Right? Put any family under a microscope, we'll find what to improve. I hope. I assume. I mean, it's poshut. But that's not the Siba. That's not the reason. And we need to really find a Rav to work with who deeply understands that. Very quickly, let's understand how, this is important to understand, how normative childhood development works in order to understand what's gone wrong with these kids. What happened to them that took this away from them? So we have a mitzvah, the Shevis Yitzhara. What's the mitzvah? It's the mitzvah of Piri Rivya, of having children. But the Chinuch points out it's because of this mitzvah, so bara, Kodesh Baruch Hu didn't create the world to be empty, ela l'sheves yitzar, that we should have people in the world. And the way I understand this mitzvah of Piri Rivya is we should bring up healthy children. Healthy in mind and body, capable of self-love, capable of loving others. That's our mandate. Kodesh Baruch Hu didn't want the world full of crazy people. He wanted the world full of healthy, normal people. So that's the job. The job is to bring children in the world who are basically healthy, capable of self-love and loving others. Well, how does that happen? In normative chinuch, how does that happen? So there are 3 stages in normative chinuch through which that expresses itself. The first stage, many of you have watched my videos, so you know this. I'm just going to say it fast. But the first stage is 0 to 2 is unconditional love. Doesn't matter what they do wrong. Doesn't matter how much they wreck your home, how much they disturb your peace of mind, your Shabbos, your life, your sleep. But 0 to 2, you're meant to hold them and smile and laugh. And if they ruin your house, take the camera out, take pictures, and laugh about it, and you'll show them at the Sheva Brachas. It'll be great. You're meant to show them there's nothing they could do wrong, nothing, that you don't find, just the ability to love them through it. That's unconditional love. That's 0 to 2. That's called nurture. When that works well, we start limit setting around 2. And so from 2 till around around bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah, we put a lot of limits. We set limits. Responsible parents have to. We don't let kids walk into the street, and we don't let them go near a hot stove. And we set limits on bedtime and all sorts of things. We try to train them and discipline them and teach them the skills of life. Well, that works beautifully for someone who had and experienced the 0 to 2 of unconditional love. When all they ever got for all their antics they put you through and the craziness and it's sometimes crazy little kids what they can do to you, how they disturb your life. But when their response was one of love, and the love just continues through the limit setting, those children experience the limit setting as an extension of the love they received the 0 to 2 years. They just experience it that way. Their nervous system just has that experience. This must be a loving thing, and they're able to receive it. Masha'enken, unfortunately, children who didn't experience that from the 0 to 2, who experienced tension and stress and pain and criticism and being yelled at when they were crying too much, etc., etc. So when the limit setting happens, they don't receive it properly. But in the ideal of all good chinuch, 0 to 2 is unconditional love. Limit setting then goes from 2 until about 13, 14, somewhere around there. And then comes guidance. We guide our children how to live healthy, productive lives, choices of schools, choices of professions, choices of yeshivas, shidduchim. We help them, and they turn to us because they feel safe. This is what normative chinuch, normative growing up should look like. When we're doing this, we should be providing our children with the 4 S's of attachment. That means they feel attached to us through the 4 S's. This I saw from Dan Siegel's book, Parenting from the Inside Out. And he talks about these 4 S's: safe, secure, seen, and soothed. that we need to provide for our children safety, where they feel safe with us. They're not going to be hurt, threatened. They're not going to be criticized and blamed and feel stupid. We need to make them feel safe and secure. They feel secure with the love a husband and wife have for each other. They feel secure about the environment of the home, that it's a stable one. They feel secure that there's going to be a Shabbos meal and it's going to be pleasant and enjoyable, not a place of threat where I'm going to be verheerd on my parsha sheet and humiliated. They need to feel secure in their lives. Seen. All children need to be seen. They need to be noticed. The real job of chinuch, the true job of chinuch, is to extract from your child what is their special beauty endowed in them by Ribbono Shel Olam. What is special about them? We're meant to notice that as parents as they get older. We're meant to extract that and mirror it back to them so they can know themselves. That's seen. And soothe, we're meant to soothe our children that when they go through the hurts of life, they go and ride their bicycle earlier than they should have, and they're not safe, and they bruise themselves or cut themselves. They first need to know they're going to be soothed, they're going to be taken care of in a healthy way and loved before we're going to have the whole, debate and discussion about why were you riding the bike and who let you ride the bike? What were you thinking when you rode that bike? Who left the bike out anyway? Before all that happens, the first thing we do is you put them on your lap and you soothe them so they feel loved and cared for. This is the ideal framework of chinuch. Okay, so now I'm not going to have a show of hands how many of us did this, right? Because we all know we didn't. We all know we didn't. No one does. But we muddle through. We do most of it. We do a lot of it. We try our best to do it. And more or less we do sort of this kind of chinuch because we're responsible parents. We're kind people. We're not heartless. We're not looking to hurt our kids. So we do. None of us are perfect. There's no one ever did perfect, safe, secure, seen and soothed all the time. No one did perfect 0 to 2. Sometimes we're exhausted and we just didn't and we couldn't. So what differentiates the kids who end up going off, struggling and becoming so profoundly hurt and so rebellious and so defiant and so disinterested in our lives? What distinguishes them from all the other families where they don't go off and they seem to stay with the system and seem to be doing okay? What happens? And the answer is all good unless trauma strikes. This is what we've learned over the years. We, as parents, basically did the same hodgepodge of parenting like everybody else. We all were pretty loving people, and we all tried to do the 4 S's and the 3 stages of development. We all had in mind to try and bring up a healthy child. None of us decided the mitzvah l'shevis must be to bring up a crazy person. Let me see if I can do that. That wasn't our decision. We're all trying to bring up healthy people. But unfortunately, and unbeknown to us, trauma struck. Most of us have no clue. We don't even know what trauma is. For many cases, we are not aware what it is. It could be looking us in the face and we'd never understand it. We certainly wouldn't understand how it impacts our children, how it hurts them. What are the different types of trauma? And how does it impact them? And aren't we just giving them excuses? The Eitzar and your neighbor or one of your friends will tell you that. You're just giving terutzim. But it's not terutzim. What happens to these children, and I've only seen one in all my career. I've been doing this work with struggling teens, struggling children, their families. It's 26 years of my 32 years of my profession have been devoted specifically to this sugya. And I can tell you that I can only recall one I ever met, one child, that I didn't figure out what was the trauma that was happening inside them, what really happened. It's always basic normative parenting that we all do, more or less. We're not great at it, we're not perfect at it, but we're not that much more imperfect than most people. But when trauma strikes, that kind of parenting wasn't enough. Regular sort of goodish parenting is not enough to create resilience. See, if you do the 4 S's brilliantly, if someone gave you the book when you were first married and you realized, I better study this, and let's learn how to do resilience, let's realize that we cannot have control. We cannot have control over whether or not our kids will experience trauma. In almost all cases, it's min hashamayim. It's something out of our control that we were so unaware of. We had no clue. We didn't know how to protect from it. We didn't know it was happening. We didn't understand it was traumatic, that our child was experiencing it that way. Had we known and done the 4 S's of resilience, had we worked incredibly hard on safe, secure, seen and soothed, then the chances are our children would have been resilient. And I've seen in certain cases, that's the terets, how in homes where they were fortunate enough to have a tremendous ribui of safe, secure, seen and soothed, because of the homes the parents came from, it's what they did. They didn't know they were doing it, but it's just what they did. In such cases, kids go through trauma and they are resilient. That means the dip of how far they're going to crash is much less, and they'll bounce back much quicker. So what we have to understand is we're dealing with the sugya of trauma. So let's understand, again, my goal is to make it very crystal clear what is trauma and what are the traumas our kids are having, so that we can have compassion from them, and then understand the sometimes what looks like crazy interventions, crazy things asked of us as parents to do, will make perfect sense in terms of how it heals our kids once we understand what the problem is. It's no different, if I may say so, than giving medication. Every single medication has in it a little bit of poison. How do we know? Because if you take 50 of them instead of the 1.5, then God forbid a person could die. They all have something of poison in them, but we give it deliberately and thoughtfully because we know that's how it's going to save someone's life. So people take medication. We've adjusted to that. What we're doing really here is saying we're going to give a little bit of poison, and that's what we're going to see later on, because that's what deals with healing the underlying trauma that the kids were struggling with in the first place. So what is the trauma? Normally, this is important when you interact with the world, because the world wants to deny this. Most people think of trauma as an event. And in fact, in the definition in the books, so the trauma is usually defined, or traditionally defined, a single event trauma. It's a life-threatening or near life-threatening event happened to someone that threw them off completely. Exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Usually it's thought of as a single event. You're going to see this is not for us. It's the emotional reaction to a terrible event, etc., which causes longer-term reactions may include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. Trauma affects the whole system of a person, and we're going to see why and what its purpose is. There are actually 5 different types of panic responses. There is, of course, normal stress response. Like when you get the bill for the mortgage and you don't have enough money in the bank account. Right? That's a normal stress reaction. That's not something that's traumatic. Well, it shouldn't be anyway. Then there's acute stress disorders. I'm not going to go through. You have in your slides, if you're interested in understanding all of these more in detail, you can go through them later. But I just want to mention them. There's acute stress disorder, which is a little more serious, but it's still not traumatic in the same way. Then comes uncomplicated PTSD. That means a single event trauma that causes the reaction of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a single event, and it's still not what we're dealing with here. Comorbid PTSD, even though people will want to tell you frequently, comorbid means when there's a mental illness or an emotional illness as well as the trauma. You have both together. And it's still usually not what we're dealing with. And then there's the sugya called complex trauma, and that's our sugya. This is the sugya all of us have to own. In order to help our children, we have to be deeply compassionate to their experience, because they will be watching you and observing you, and they will be driven away from you, from us as parents, unless we become deeply compassionate of what's happened to them inside. They're little kids that have experienced complex trauma. I'm going to jump through these. So let's take a look at complex PTSD. So, well, actually, one second. Yeah, let me jump to this one. I'm going to go backwards. PTSD. What is PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, think of your children. Just think of them when they're having one of their strong emotional reactions to you because you're trying to get them to help with something, or get up in the morning, or put on a yarmulke in the house because you want to, force them to do it. Just think of their reaction. Look at the words that define, this is in DSM-5 now, that defines PTSD. They will have a severe psychological reaction. In their language, that means they'll freak out, right? At exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the original trauma. Now think how nuanced that really is. This is the definition in the book. Think of the nuances of the details and small things. A small look on your face of slight disappointment to a child who feels completely rejected by our community and our life and our schools and by their Rebbeim and everybody else, and has been dealing with rejection their whole life, and they see that look of pain on your face, which they interpret as another form of rejection. And the child is likely to have a severe psychological reaction. They will freak out. So we have to understand this is the cornerstone of understanding trauma. When we see our children's reactions to us, and they're constantly freaking out on us, and the alternative to freaking out for many of the kids is isolating. They're so fed up with freaking out that many of them will head to their rooms and not come out. Or sleep till late in the day, go out at night, and come back in the wee hours of the morning to avoid us. Because they don't want to be around us. They don't want to be triggered. They can't handle it. They don't even know what it is that's happening to them, but they don't want to be triggered. So they will isolate and separate to avoid being triggered by that pained look on our face, or that disappointed sound, or sigh, or shoulders dropping when we see them and engage them. This is all part of how we're going to help these kids, by understanding how they get hurt in the first place. Let's go back a moment. So complex PTSD is actually a myriad, for many of these kids, of micro-traumas. Each one of them on their own would not be enough to throw a kid off, to throw them out of life. No way. But when you put it day after day, for example, we're going to come later on to talk about learning trauma, but if the experience of your child is for whatever reason they can't learn, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why they may not be able to learn, and we have them in a yeshiva where they're being encouraged to be metzionim, to be outstanding, to be very good at learning, and they, for whatever reason of their own, can't do it. And so every single experience of going into school is a micro-trauma for them. It's an affirmation that I'm stupid. It's an affirmation that I'm not wanted. I'm not part of this system. Each one on its own would never be enough to throw a kid off. But if we send a kid back into that experience day after day after day, their rejection of us and the system, they experience their life as traumatic. Because it's an affirmation, I'm worthless, I'd rather die. And many of these kids will simply express, and everyone's always astonished when they express, I don't want to live. What am I living for? Why am I living? That's not a suicidal statement. That's an expression of deep trauma and hurt and pain. And then, if we don't understand this sugya, we hire them a tutor. See, it sounds so logical. Yeah, sure, get them a tutor. They'll be able to learn. Guess what happens to these kids who can't learn with tutoring and tutoring and tutoring and tutoring is they become adults who feel worthless, so worthless inside, it's so hard for them to open a Gemara. They don't want any shaykhs to the whole thing. Because basically you tried your whole life to make me someone I wasn't. For which they hate us too. Complex PTSD is not necessarily about a single event, although it is quite common that these kids suffer not just with single event trauma, which they have too. They have complex trauma and they have single event trauma, as we will understand a bit as we go forward. Trauma is the sugya here. Not for us, everyone in this room. If you walk home today without grasping this, then you wasted your time being here. This is the sugya. And we have to deeply, deeply understand what is the trauma inside our kids, and therefore we can work out what are the appropriate interventions that help of our responsibility as parents to help our kids heal from it. Look what we said here. They can exhibit behavioral issues such as impulsivity, aggression, substance abuse, sexual impulsivity, or extreme emotions such as intense rage, depression, or panic. How many of us have tried to talk to our kids and they look like they're psychotic? You're just trying to get them to accommodate a little something, whether it's a little sneers or a little this, or just wash your hands, make a bracha, something, and they freak out. That's a traumatic reaction that we're going to understand deeply and therefore understand what to do with it. So what is the trauma? So we've got three areas that I talk about. One area is relational developmental, especially sexual abuse. We'll come to that. Then there's learning spiritual, and then de facto learning disabilities. That's kids who go through different problems, issues, and struggles in life that so bother them, they so fill their mind with pain, confusion, and frustration that there's no way they can go to school and learn properly. It's a de facto learning disability. They're not learning disabled, but the head is verstopft with so much problems and issues and struggles, there's no shaykhs for them to go to learn, so that becomes a de facto learning disability. Let's take a look quickly at relational developmental traumas. They fall into 5 groups, and there's obvious overlap between them. And they are physical abuse. These are where the kid feels abused. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse. These are the 5 realms in which kids experience what is effectively abuse. And again, if it's one time, we can all handle it. When it's myriad of multiple little micro traumas in any of these departments happening again and again and again, you end up with complex trauma. The nervous system, the body reacts, as we will see soon, to protect the child, to protect the human being from being hurt again. Physical abuse. So physical abuse, it used to be that svei pech, that solved every problem. Most of us grew up that way. Right? In today's world, we grew up being caned. That was a normative part of Chinuch. It wasn't done all the time, but occasionally we got caned. Today you do that, you go to jail. You go to jail. The world has changed, and the new world we live in, the svei pech can actually be traumatic. It makes a kid, can make a child feel afraid of their own parents, terrified of life. Certainly being beaten up, and where physical abuse is used as the primary, or physical hitting, it becomes physical abuse. So physical trauma with the kids who are scared of their parents or scared of going to school because they might be hit. That's one of the traumas. Emotional trauma. Again, I don't think we have time to go through all of this, all the details, but emotional trauma relates to a child whose sense of self, they're made to feel worthless. They're made to feel that we deny their right to their emotions. We shame them for having emotions. And it ends up with their self-esteem being destroyed. And again, I remind you one more time that one single event of ever doing this is not going to do it. But when it's a constant pattern of denial of their sense of self, of who they are, you shouldn't think that way. There's a good example of what in this day and age can actually be traumatic for a child, to be told you shouldn't be thinking that way. Well, the kid is. So every time they think that way, all they have in their mind is, I'm a disappointment, a failure, a bad person, because I do think that way. You can't tell a person you shouldn't think that way. You could actually explore, why do you think that way? Let me understand what your thinking is. But to tell them you can't think that way can cause emotional abuse. Demanding perfection, ignoring, neglecting, abandoning, or indulging the child. As a matter of fact, the worst form probably of all these emotional traumas is emotional neglect, where we have, we have children growing up in large families where they don't feel enough attention, enough focus on their uniqueness, can cause emotional neglect, where the child's they're brought up as the kids. It's like, get the kids in the car, let's get the kids into bed, let's get the kids, it's the kids. There's this group of things called the kids. But what they don't experience is the uniqueness, that they're all different. They're not just this thing, this glob called the kids. But they're all unique. Hooray, wait till they're older, and the youngest is 20 and the oldest is 40, and you discover they're completely different to each other. Definitely different in so many ways. And yet, if we parent them in this way, they're the kids. It can create the experience of emotional neglect, where they don't feel you really tune into what and who they are. Psychological, some people call it intellectual abuse. The confusion of values probably best sums that up, where we teach them one thing and we do another. Where we insist on their perfection in mitzvahs, for example, where we don't have it ourselves. That's psychological abuse. It's pushed crazy. It makes them crazy. And kids will exploit that and see us. We have to be ourselves very, very consistent with who we are and how we live. And we certainly can't expect more of them than we do of ourselves in terms of our lives. Any contradiction, hypocritical parental behavior. There's an interesting one, 3 or more relocations during elementary school years for people who've moved around. They can interrupt the ability to socialize for children, which causes psychological damage in them because they don't feel connected. And kids need peers and friends as part of their development. They need it crucially. So many, many relocations, or at least 3, seem to bring about this kind of neglect. Lack of parental shalom bayis goes without saying. It's obvious. Sexual abuse. This, of course, is probably the key for most of our kids. In the research we've done, it turns out that most of the children who are struggling and have gone off, the vast majority, the trauma they experienced was actually sexual trauma. And this is so important for us to understand. The figures are quite staggering, that this is probably the main trauma that drives our kids off. And if any therapists in the room, I say this all the time, when we interview kids, those who work with children, and certainly, it happens with parents all the time, but we ask the kids, were you ever molested? And the kids say, no. The kids say no right away. And they write it down. The kid was not molested. So they come to me afterwards saying, I don't know, I disagree with your statistics, Rabbi Russell. It's not true. They said no, I asked them. I said, well, what did you do then? Well, we moved on to other things. I cannot tell you how mind-boggling that is to me. Totally, utterly mind-boggling. It is so incredibly... All the kids walk in and deny having been molested because it's embarrassing, it's shaming. And a third of them were not only molested, but molested others. So they zicha don't want to go near that sugya. They zicha don't want to touch that. So they all deny it when they come in, and that's why we end up with idiotic diagnoses and medications and all sorts of stuff, because we got the wrong subject. It is a very simple, at least in my practice, I say this to the professionals who are sitting here, that the easy, simple way through this is to honor the kid. I ask them, were you ever molested? Very often they react, by the way, say, don't even ask me if I was molested. I don't want to hear about that. All the therapists ask me, I told them no, I'm not, and they get very upset. And so then you for sure know they were, obviously, but that's not the issue. The question is, how do we get them to heal if they don't know what they're dealing with? So I ask them really simple like this. I say, I respect you, I understand you. As you sit here right now, you're telling me you were not molested. And I'm going to tell you that I trust and believe exactly that's how you feel. You're not lying to me. I'm going to accept that. Okay, they calm down a little bit. And then I say to them, would it be okay with you if I give you like a half-hour description of what sexual abuse includes? Would that be all right with you? Could I explain to you the full sugya of sexual abuse? Take me about half an hour, and I'll cover all the bases of what actually is sexual abuse. Would that be okay with you? I never, ever had a kid who said no. They all say yes. Sure. Sure. And I give them a half-hour drasha on what exactly is sexual abuse, including the fact that you don't even need an abuser to be abused. Sexual abuse, for example, I tell them, can occur. I want to be precise. I'm not saying will occur, but can and is likely to occur at the exposure to pornography. A small child, a frum, yeshivsha, tmimistig, sweet kid, that gets exposed by accident to pornography, which actually happens in a whole slew of ways. There's no actual abuser. There's not a person who's an abuser, but trust me, they become abused. As all people, technically speaking, what pornography can do to people, it becomes abusive. But I explain to them the sugya of abuse. What is it? What is touching? What's inappropriate? Because they have things they did as siblings, they put it out of their minds as experimentation, or the person didn't know. I go through the sugya explaining all the possibilities of what we call sexual abuse. And I can tell you, it sounds dishonest, but I can't recall a case where when I finished that description to a kid, they didn't turn to me and say, well, look, if that's how you're going to define it, well, then I guess I was abused. I can't recall a case where that didn't happen. And these are kids who have been to multiple therapists, asked the question, denied it happened, mostly because they didn't really understand what it was, what the subject was, because they were thinking of some rape or some heinous crime. They had the wrong paradigm in their heads. Problem with sexual abuse for our kids, and why it's the number one reason that kids go off, and therefore the number one thing we're going to have to understand and help them work through in their lives. The reason is because our system, our life, has no place for any sexual activity till you get married. There is nothing positive, there's nothing helpful, there's nothing supportive we can say when the cat is out the bag, when a child has become part of a sexually active community. Prior to being married, in our world, that's a disaster. It's an utter disaster. Imagine a young girl who has been molested and has become sexually active with herself because of it. And her mother and school fuss over this button, this top button being buttoned up. Now she's aware of who she is and what she's doing and what she's interested in. And you're fussing over a button. What do you think that button experience is like to her? In her mind, she's saying to herself, if you would know, you're fussing over this button? If you would know where my interests are and what I do and how I behave and how I fantasize, you would shecht me. You'd throw me out your house. And her projection into that is that she throws herself psychologically out of your house already. Same thing with the boys. Young teenagers, they've been molested. They were molested when they were young. Just imagine the life of what one of these typical, the most common cases. I'm not going to go through them all, but I just want to make sure we get deeply into their hearts with compassion so that we can understand the interventions and the tolerance and love we need to have for them to help them heal. Imagine a boy, most of the boys are molested very young. The first time they're very, very young when they're taken into this world. It can be in primary and first grade when older boys are already playing with them inappropriately. Most of these kids will discover that the sexual acting out for those boys will lay dormant, excuse me, it will lay dormant inside them until they hit puberty, 13. So here's this kid. He was a little kid. I'm working with someone right now who from 5 to 10 was molested almost daily by an uncle who was meant to be looking after him for 5 years. What we've helped him understand, how does it go for 5 years? How come he never told anyone? Like everyone says, well, what's wrong with you? Why don't you tell anyone? And the answer is really because they're too shocked the first time it happened. And by the time they realize what's happening to them, tragically, there's another aspect of abuse is that, wow, if my uncle is doing this with me, I must be special. I must be very special. So the poor kid is being tormented daily for years, going to a cheder in school where he knows if they would find out what he's doing, they're teaching him one thing, and he knows where his mind is every day. And at the same time, the wires in his brain of self-esteem, of being chashuv, if my uncle needs me like this, and this, inappropriate, this way, it makes me feel very grown up and special. On some primitive part of his brain, it makes him feel chashuv. And the wires of chashivas and feeling special are now wound up together with the wires of sexuality, with a little electric cap on top and some electric wire. And they sit there in his brain dormant. One day, he hits puberty. He hits puberty. This is, by the way, this is the most classic story. What I'm describing to you is the most common story of what happens to our boys. One day he hits puberty, and tivas, lust, sexual current goes through the wire in his brain about lust and tivas. And tragically for him, because of the molestation, the wire that connects to feeling chashuv and special was attached to that wire. That means when he feels sexual, he feels special. And he has no one to talk to, no one to understand it, no one to help him with it, and in fact discovers he's now in a masifta, a high school, where on a regular basis, and I mean this with a full heart, the well-meaning Rebbeim, and I mean that fully, are trying to be mechazik the children in the class by letting them know about not touching themselves and shmir sinayim and shmir saguf, and he's giving drushes of passion to be mechazik the children about how they should be careful not to touch themselves, and careful when they go to the bathroom, and careful with their eyes. And he gives drushes and stories of what happens to you, the good and the bad, if you do these things, unaware that sits avec in that class is a kid who was molested for 5 years, and now is, every time he feels sexually, he feels special, and so he becomes sexually active with himself. So who am I? Who would, if my Rebbe would know, if my parents would know what I'm experiencing, what I feel, what would they do with me? They'd shech me. For sure, they'd throw me right out of school. And it gets much worse than this. It's much worse than what I'm describing. It's much worse. When a boy hits puberty, a regular normal boy who was never, when I say normal, he was normal in the sense of not having been molested, pre-puberty by older boys. A regular boy hits puberty, he develops taivas noshim and a disgust for taivas anoshim. Hashem does that for us. He gives us with both taivas noshim and a disgust, a nauseous reaction to taivas anoshim. Well, guess what happens to these boys who are molested by men or older boys pre-puberty? In their neural pathways in their brain, there's a program that diminishes the development of the nauseous reaction to male sexuality. That means this boy, when he hits puberty, will likely develop generic taiva, and it can be for girls or boys, men or women. He doesn't have, it's taken from him, that nauseous reaction that a man should have when he hits 13. That's not developed in him. That means he's now sitting in that same masifta, that same yeshiva, with his friends, where not only will he have to deal with the daily, weekly affirmation that he's a piece of disgusting dirt, who, if his Rebbe knew about him, would throw him out. Not only does he deal with that, but he has to deal with the fact that he finds himself sexually attracted to other boys in his class and in his school. Imagine just if we could just for a millisecond try and dare his feeling. What does his life feel like? And all this is held inside. You understand? It's held inside him because he has no safe place in his life to go and talk about this. Because wherever he would talk about it, he would find disgust, disappointment, disapproval, shame, embarrassment, and probably rejection, complete rejection. What is he meant to do? How's he meant to cope? I gave a mashal one time for us to try and understand this. This is what his feelings are like. You have a daughter that gets engaged, Baruch Hashem, and then she gets married, and 3 months after she's married, healthy, gesunte, beautiful Beis Yaakov girl, and she gets married, and 3 months later, after she's married, she comes and tells her mother, in a sweet, tzniastika kind of way, Mummy, I think I'm expecting. Now, what is that moment like for a mother? There's probably no greater joy. Am I right or wrong? It's a moment of such joy, such excitement. There's tears and hugs and just, wow. It's like, right? You feel so ma'usha. You can't imagine a better experience than that moment. Am I right? Can we all relate to that? No one turns to her and says, you had sex? You did what? Chas v'shalom. Chas v'shalom. She doesn't... We understand. She joined that community. She got married, and we support it. And we're proud of you. And we don't ask you how you got pregnant. It's none of our business. We're just happy you're pregnant. Right? We got that. It's an incredibly joyful moment for us as frum Jews, and we do not do some chakira about how did you get pregnant. We're just happy. Now imagine a girl gets engaged, and 3 months before the wedding, she comes to her mother and says, Mommy, I think I'm pregnant. Imagine the Gehinnom. Imagine the feeling, what that feels like. There's probably no more unbearable pain than that. Where you feel like your life just fell apart. You want to just open the trapdoor, take me down to Gehenna, I'm gone, I'm out of here. You have no clue how to live, how to go forward, how to exist with such news. That experience is what our children are feeling every day. Every day, these abused kids feel like this. The pain, the loss, the fear, the shame, the hurt, the unbearable sense of me being a person who I know if everyone knew what I was up to, they would all reject me. I'm dead, I'm gone, I'm finished. That's what our kids feel like. And for us not to be able to connect with that, to be noisable, to cry with them. How can we not cry with them? And how do we dare blame them? If anything, we didn't protect them. And then we're angry with them? If anything, we had the responsibility to protect them. That was our job. And tragically, for whatever reason, we weren't able to. And we're mad? We're angry? The problem with sexual abuse is it creates a disruption or distortion of normative sexual development. So yes, the boys and girls, the norms of how a person should develop are not on for them. In their coping and their experiencing, just trying to get through life, experimenting with sexuality. If a girl was molested by a man, a boy, it's very likely and possible she's going to go through a stage, a phase, or may permanently orient towards women, not men. Because of her shame, because of her pain. And then we get mad with them for that too. It is so destructive to life. And the worst part is for them that we're trying to keep them in the system. And instead of understanding that a girl's struggle with tznius is a red flag flashing, a red light flashing in front of you, I've been abused, we actually huck them on tznius. We actually try to force them to dress right because we're afraid the school's going to kick them out. I mean, Hashem Yirachim. Who cares? Take him out of school. Our job is to reach inside the hearts and souls of our kids, that we need to know them and they need to know we know them. We owe it to them. When we observe the struggles, the external struggles they're going through, their dress code and behavior, it's simply informing us that there's a deep-rooted hurt, trauma inside this kid. And Hashem Yerachim, what do? It's like, God forbid, a person has like a serious, life-threatening illness, and he gets like wounds and marks on his body, and you see these spots, and so the answer is, let's get some cover-up so that you'll look fine. Let's put cover-up on it, because you can't go to school like that, it'll look bad. Are we crazy? I want to say one more comment on this. That the secondary trauma of not being taken seriously for an abuse victim, for not listening to their narrative, not embracing their story, not searching to understand them, and certainly rejecting as if, it wasn't that bad. You sure it happened? We don't want to cause problems in the family when you find out it was an uncle or another relative. The worst ones I get, the most painful and difficult ones, where the girls become suicidal. Like classic norms, where an older brother molested her. She was 9 years old. And from 9 to 11, she was molested by an older brother who was then 14 to 16. Eventually it stopped. He probably went off a little bit, maybe not. He pulled his life together. And somehow, thank you. Somehow, this young man pulls his life together, gets into some yeshiva type place in Eretz Yisrael, and he gets married. Meanwhile, his sister is out of school, struggling. No one's told anyone what really happened yet. And guess what? The parents, we, are so happy he straightened out. We're so happy he married a frum girl. And we're so happy with this simcha that's coming up. And what is she feeling? He pulled it together, and her life is wrecked, ruined. He's the hero now in our family. How torn can we be as parents? It's a miracle we all don't become psychotic as parents. How to cope with the double bind. That on the one hand, I've got this kid who I struggled with for years and years, and finally they got married, and finally they're settling down. And now she's in a hospital because she's cutting and self-harming, and we can't keep her safe. The sugya, you understand, of crisis chinuch. To even call it crisis chinuch, this is first aid. We're healing souls here. And it needs something very different. And this is not about keeping them in the system and keeping them focused. This is about us reaching very, very deeply inside their incredibly wounded souls to show them love, to show them we care. And to do that, we need to cry with them. We need to be in a place of understanding of what they're hurting with and stop trying to fix the outside, fix this and fix that. But instead understand what is the message. I once said a story that you want to send a vase, you want to send a gift to a relative across the country for an engagement present. So you pack it up in a box with all those little styrofoam pellets. I forget what they're called. What are they called? Peanuts. There you go. You put these peanuts inside, you pack it in there, and you strap it up. and you take it to the post office, to and from, and right before you send it, you put a sticker on that box, a red sticker. You know what it says? Fragile, handle with care. These are our kids. Their behavior, their clothing, their attitude, their speech, their chilul Shabbos, their drug use, their sexual activity is a red sticker that says fragile, handle with care. Our focus is not on those details. Our focus is on their broken hearts. We have to go deeply into the broken heart. And guess what? When you heal the broken hearts, the other stuff sheds. And when you focus always on the other stuff, you make the heart worse. You break it more. Spiritual abuse is the fifth of relational developmental traumas. And spiritual abuse, the only one I want to mention right now is oppressive Frumkeit. Oppressive Frumkeit is for these kids. Can you now understand why oppressive Frumkeit makes no sense? It's so destructive. With these kind of children, you know, we should be the greatest Bekiim on earth on finding heterim for everything. And if you can't find a heter, find the strength to look away. Just find the strength to look away. I tell most people, most of us, we're yotze our chiyuv in chinuch. You know what that means? That means if you gave your kid a multiple choice test of your 10 most chashuv hashkafas about tznius, about Shabbos, about kashrus, about drugs, about anything. Put down your 10 of your hashkafas and then tell your teenager, if you can identify correctly my hashkafas, I'll give you $1,000 and 2 tickets for you and your friend to go anywhere you want in the world on vacation. How many of you believe your kid wouldn't get all 10 right? They'd get all 10 right. We have no suffix, right? Which tells you, you umekayim mitzvahs chinuch. You taught them the gedarim of halacha and Torah and mitzvahs and values. You're done. We are not meant to be the police. We're not meant to be a Bezdin or a Sanhedrin. We're not enforcers of Torah and mitzvahs. We're purveyors. We're meant to purvey it to our children. We're meant to teach it to them, educate them as best we can in our values, and that I honestly believe we did. But those values can't be upheld while a child is struggling with trauma, and you have to let it go because of that. And when I say let it go, that does not mean, I'm hearing the critics, watching this video. That does not mean you let go of everything all the time for the rest of your life. Okay, are we clear? It means as appropriate under the guidance of your Rav that you let go of stuff when necessary in order to reach your child's heart and help them heal. Because not letting them go does the opposite. You have to see their behavior as that red sticker, fragile, handle with care. I just reminded myself that when I said number 3 on this page, secondary trauma of not being taken seriously, I just want to reiterate, is more damaging long-term to a human being than the actual abuse itself. Or let's be precise. Secondary trauma of not being believed is frequently, with most people, far more damaging than the actual trauma itself. Okay, I think I said it right this time. Okay? We have to understand that any doubting them about the impact on their life or what happened or who did it is so profoundly destructive. It's worse than the trauma itself. So what are the traumas and the abuse related to from kids? What are we looking at with the kids who are struggling? There's the ones with the learning disabilities, as I've described, because our system is primarily about academia. We are teaching Torah all day long to kids for hours and hours on end and trying to imbue them with our values and Chachmas HaTorah. So if you can't do that, what other ways are there to feel that you're incredibly special? Anything more than tolerated at best. How? So learning disabilities create real destructiveness, and the sooner we get kids like that into a working situation, as Rabbi Shimon mentioned earlier, that we can get them out of the system of school, get them a chavrusa once a day on a level where they can learn and enjoy and be able to learn something, and get them to work with some El Chagai, get them apprenticed, get them out. But don't keep them in the system. Because the system for learning disabled kids in their teen years is destructive. Or get them into the schools and programs that are appropriate that work with kids like this. De facto learning disabilities include child-centered, family-centered, environmental problems and issues that kids have within themselves, like impulse disorder, for example. There's something in the kid, or having a poor hearing or poor sight. All these kind of things create de facto learning disabilities, and we have to realize that pushing kids like that to be able to compete in a highly academic system is just not fair. And we have to get them into systems that work with them, that understand them, that can relate to them. Family-centered issues that belong in the home. Obviously, at the end of this, you'll see I put a lot about Shalom Bayis, but it's crucial for us to provide an environment of support and love and caring to wrap our kids with. We need to actually do more work on ourselves when we have kids like this than anybody else. This is not an option for us. This is a must. To provide an environment where they can feel loved, we have to do what it takes to change the environment we're in to make it into a loving one. Environmental things are like sexual abuse. In the research we did, and I did this research years and years ago, we found that of all the risk factors, and there were about 24 different risk factors, sexual abuse was reported by 80% of all off the derech kids. When asked by someone who knows how to ask, 80% of them report having been sexually abused. So we know that the vast majority of the kids who are struggling with sexual abuse, with their own sexuality, and they need help with that desperately. The next highest on the list, just by comparison, was ADD. Kids who reported ADD. And that was about 46%. And then the other risk factors were less. But sexual abuse stood out. And I'll tell you what else stood out that was incredible in the research. This, again, I say this to deepen our compassion. That we asked the kids, when something occurred to you, like, let's say your parents were divorced, so what grade were you in when they got divorced? Or let's say you got molested. What grade we did this from kindergarten, primary through 8th grade, those grades. Yeah, primary through 8th. What grades were you in when this happened to you? So a kid got molested, they would respond 3rd grade was when they were molested. And we then asked them, what grade were you in when you got effective professional help for the problem that you were going through? That means they were actually engaged in some sort of therapeutic process. By the way, that therapeutic process could be with their own parents. I'm not talking about going to therapy necessarily. A therapeutic process where someone cares about you, someone reaches out to you, someone connects with you and hears you and validates you and works with you. What grade were you in when that happened? And when we looked at the respondees, it turned out that from primary, which is age 5, to 8th grade, which is 12, 13, the disparity between when they experienced a problem and when they actually got effective treatment was 6.5 years. That's basically most of their life. Turns out that most of them carried these problems alone without having any real help. Powerful destructive processes going on inside them without any effective help. And had we known what I'm trying to teach now, to read the behavior, the lack of tznius, the acting out, the sleeping in, the isolation, the drinking, the drugging, had we known how to read it and simply see it was that fragile handle with care sticker and connect with them, it's quite conceivable that we would make shallower their dip and help them come back much quicker. Instead, what did almost all of us do? Because we got poor guidance. I know we did. We got horrible guidance. Well, we actually got no guidance because I wasn't here yet, so there wasn't any. But the guidance we did have was the exact opposite of what our kids needed. It was the svei patch, you've just got to let them know that you can't do that. Just let them know. Well, how well does that work? Just letting them know. How many kids say, oh, thanks for telling me. You know, I feel much better now. Let me just go and get my sneer sticker clothing out. We know it's crazy. It's completely crazy. And as a matter of fact, again, we're talking about the kids in the most serious kind of matzavim. I'll say this to you. Any kid that you could go to your child and talk to them about their behavior, about their dress code, you know, whatever it is you're trying to invade in their life and change. And you have a relationship with them where you could say it to them and they might be upset with you today, but tomorrow they'll be fine with you, then you should go tell them. Go to Chinuch. We shouldn't be afraid of our kids. That's Chinuch. You understand, if they're mad with you today, but tomorrow they love you, that's called being a kid. No one likes being criticized or told or having limits set on them. So if you ground them or you do something to them and you tell it to them in a fair and honest and kind but serious way, even if they're mad with you today, but they'll be fine with you tomorrow, then you should go tell them. That's not the subject we're talking about here. We know very well what happens when we try to. First of all, you try to tell them and they're gone. They hang up the phone or they run screaming out the room or curse you. We're dealing with that sugya. But avada, if you could tell your kids, even if they're mad with you, but tomorrow they're not mad with you, then you should go and tell them. You understand? This sugya is where you tell them that stuff and you lose your relationship with your kid. And quite honestly, you're all they have. We quickly discover as parents in this sugya that we are all they have. They have nothing else. Everything else is temporary. Therapists, rebbeim, teachers, and I'm talking about the good ones. The good therapists, the good rebbeim, the good teachers. That's all temporary. We are all they have. Long term. We're it. And it is our relationship with our kid, our unconditional love for our child, is the only possible thing that could sustain them and help them survive these years and grow into a healthy person. There is nothing else. All the rest is temporary. So if you could tell your kid without compromising that, go tell him. Do chinuch. Don't be scared. But if you know you're going to lose the relationship with them, Hashem Yirachim, don't say anything. Adarabah. Connect with their pain. Make their life easier, as we'll come later on to understand. I want to say just a quick word about impulse disorder. So what is, most of the kids going through this sugya will get a diagnosis, an official diagnosis somewhere of ADD, ODD, oppositional defiant disorder or attention deficit disorder. Can I just do this? Quick show of hands. Anyone who has a kid who ever got that diagnosis? Okay, take a look. Most hands. It's like crazy. Most hands. Right. So I want to tell you, some of your kids might actually have it. They might. But almost all kids going through this sugya will emulate having an impulse disorder. Because impulse disorder looks almost identical to a traumatic reaction of survival, fight and flight. It looks almost identical. In fact, you'd have to be so seasoned as a professional for years and years in both areas to be able to know which is which. I can tell you I don't. I frequently don't know which one it is, but I lean on trauma because the treatment is anyway going to help. But I want to explain, just so you have a little compassion, what is an impulse disorder. Kadosh Baruch Hu put inside us the ability to protect ourselves from being hurt, from danger. So in the brain, there's a place of cognition. Cognition is where you're aware, your brain becomes aware that there's a threat coming your way. Right? Some sort of threat. And it could be a threat that you're trying to get the kids off to school and you realize you have to leave at a certain time and you got to get to work and that clock is ticking and you're there. You're feeling threatened. Does that make sense? You can imagine the experience. And you start getting tense. Then that's the threat. Then there's reaction. You have to decide how to react to the threat. Well, people without an impulse disorder have a space, it's like a synapse in the brain. You have a space between cognition and reaction. In this space, we develop a hierarchy of possible reactions that best deal with this situation and preserve personal dignity. I'll give you another example. Let's say we leave this hall and you go to your car outside and you're halfway between the door of the building and the car and a huge dog comes ferociously barking from the far corner of the parking lot, comes running at you. What are you going to do? That's cognition, right? That's a threat. A huge barking dog for most of us is frightening. So if you don't have an impulse disorder, we have a space. In this space, we develop a hierarchy of possible responses. So you might want to run back in the building. You might want to run to your car, fumble with your keys, hope you get in quick enough. You might want to jump up on a car. You might want to climb up a lamppost. You'll do whatever it takes to survive, but you'll take the highest one that preserves personal dignity. So, for example, a man might climb on a car or climb up a pole, a lamppost, quicker than a lady would. That's going to be lower in terms of dignity for a woman who's going to probably want to do something else instead of climbing up a lamppost, right? A man might just go straight up the lamppost and be safe. The idea is, Kadosh Baruch Hu created this, where I protect myself from danger, but I choose the highest one that best preserves personal dignity. Does that make sense? That's how a normal person is. Watch this. I'm about to show you what an impulse disorder is. Watch closely. Ready? That's an impulse disorder. Should I do it again? Cognition, that's the awareness that something is about to attack me, threaten me, kill me, hurt me. I'm frightened. Reaction, I have to do something. What am I going to do? I'm going to choose off this list, right? I'm going to choose the best one for personal dignity. Ready? This is an impulse disorder. You go straight from cognition to reaction, and you don't care about personal dignity. There's no time to think through what's best for personal dignity. An example in case is a 5-year-old who has a true impulse disorder, which is about the earliest you could really diagnose it, because everyone under 5 has impulse disorder. Because it's not disorder, it's called being under 5, right? So about 5, 6 is the earliest you could really get it. But let's say a 10-year-old who's got a real impulse disorder. comes home and finds his 5-year-old playing with his favorite Lego. What happens? The moment he sees it, he's cognition. He's threatened. He took my Lego. Now, he doesn't have a space. If he has a space, he can go over and say, Mommy, he took my Lego again. What should I do? Because you've trained him what to do. And he goes down the list. He's trying to preserve personal dignity. What does a kid with an impulse disorder do? He kicks his brother hard. He yells at him, kicks him, and grabs the Lego away. They both did the same thing. All they both wanted was to get the Lego back. But if you don't have a space to process, do you understand? I will posit to you that in the case of trauma, they are so deeply frightened and reactive, as I will show shortly, they don't have that space either. And the first thing they're going to do is to do something that helps me with personal survival. I just want to survive. There is no space to process options. And whatever I need now because I need to survive, because I feel my life is threatened. So impulse disorder, turns out to be very, very similar to the traumatic reaction we see in kids, where they don't process choices. So guess what? How do we treat impulse disorder? What's the treatment? The entire treatment of impulse disorder evolves around us outside, parents, teachers, rabbis, whoever we are, being compassionately engaged. And guess what we do? This is going to sound counterintuitive, but this is how treatment works. We're going to validate their choice. Because if you don't validate their choice, guess what? You became another threat. If you say to your kid, I've told you how many times, don't kick your brother, come talk to me. He turns at you and curses you and says you shouldn't have let him take in the first place and I can't trust you. And if you're not going to deal with it, I am. And he screams and defends himself and kicks his brother 2 more times. You have to validate first. You have to pull him aside and say, I understand. I'm not agreeing, but boy, do I understand why you kicked your brother. Again, I'm not agreeing it's the right move, but I'm totally understanding why you kicked him. You kicked him because he took your Lego, and no one protected your Lego. And you go on and on about how no one protected your Lego. And I should have, and I didn't notice, and I feel bad for you, and I guess it was very hurtful to you to walk in and again see that your brother took your favorite Lego. And I get it why you kicked him. That's the first thing. You know why? Because when you do that, guess what you're doing? You're getting him ready for this, to open a space. You cannot open a space with an impulse disordered kid or a trauma victim. You cannot open a space unless you make him feel safe. So although it's counterintuitive, I'm not complimenting him on kicking his brother in the head. I'm not saying, good shot. Wow, you really, wow. I see the marks. Wow, wow. Look at that. You got stitches. He's bleeding. It's great. Did good. You understand? We're not going that crazy. But we are validating that I get it why you did it. I understand that. And when you do that and validate deeply, you ever so little open a space. And in the space, you offer him options for next time. You offer him choices. And you say, Shefela, I get it why you did it. Next time, come running to me right away. Next time, let's hide your favorite Lego. You come up with ideas for him. Next time, if you see him playing with it, I'm going to spend extra time with you and play a game with you, just you and me, because I understand how much that hurt you. You find something, and you open a space for him by creating safety. And anything other than that, you get the expected reaction, which is probably just going to make the situation far worse than it was already. So let's move through impulse disorder. We know what that is. You have the list in your thing if you see what it is. And I just want to say, here, opening the spaces. When we validate the choices of traumatized or what look like impulse disorder kids. Validate their choices. We've created safety. As crazy as this sounds, because most people, that intuitively, how am I going to validate? I found out that my kid was smoking pot in his room on Shabbos. Now, and I know he's, again, I want to assume that your Rav has paskened with you already that we're dealing with a Southfield Nefesh story, and therefore you've been told to look away. Leave it alone. It's in his room. What's your first reaction when you walk in the room and see it? What would you like your first reaction to be when you walk in the room and see him? You see, we have to take ourselves to a place where I understand the reason he's doing it is because he's in horrible pain and he's self-medicating. And I don't know if you could understand this. Assuming you're dealing with a case of Southfield Nefesh, he might actually be doing the right thing. Because the alternative of what he may do to himself could be so terrible to take his pain away. I once had I sat with a girl who had been self-harming. She was a sexual abuse victim, raped by a brother and the brother's best friend had raped her on more than one occasion when she was a little girl. I met her as a teenager and had the privilege to work with her. She taught me probably more about this field than I ever learned in college or anywhere else. She taught me, the first thing she ever taught me was about self-harming. She had a lot of cuts and burns on her body, and I asked her about the burns, why she does it. And she looked at me like shocked. She says, "You don't really get it, do you?" None of us did in those days, by the way, and they were still using very old-fashioned techniques for self-harmers. She had actually been, this is about 20 years ago, she'd been in a certain hospital ward where they strapped her arms down like in a straitjacket because she was self-harming. They strapped her down. Anyway, I sat with her and we talked, and I said, "You know what, you're right. Can you teach me? Teach me what you can. Teach me what it's about for you," which I do with all the kids that I don't understand. They open up immediately and they're glad to teach. So I asked her, "Can you teach it to me?" And she explained to me that when her mind goes back to the rape, or rapes actually, when her mind went back there, she was so in pain she wanted to die. She wanted to throw herself out of a window or off a building. She couldn't live. She couldn't deal with it. She just felt so vulnerable, so unsafe in the world, so scared of her own existence, she wanted to die. Which, as we tragically know, kids frequently do. Frequently. So I said to her, "Well, how does this help?" And as I'm talking to her, she's sitting there smoking in front of me. She's about 3 feet away from me. And she takes out a cigarette and plunged it into her hand. And she looked me in the eye. She didn't break any eye contact. She kept eye contact with me. And she said, "Well, you think this hurts? Really, you think this hurts?" And I can smell her flesh sizzling. I can smell it and hear it burning. And she holds it there, realizing I was so tormented. I didn't know what to do with myself. And she kept talking to me about, "Well, you think this hurts, right? Well, you think this hurts? You think this is painful?" And then she takes another thing. And I see this fresh burn on her hand. And she explains to me how when she anticipates doing that and then recovers with the pain, she can get days and days, sometimes up to a week of days. She can get days and days of freedom from the other memory that she's thinking about inside, because this hurts so bad now. afterwards. She gets freedom from the other stuff. Our job is to go into the kishkas of their pain, is to understand why this is not philosophical. I met one kid in my entire career that I could not identify the trauma. I took him out to dinner twice to try and work it out. He went out graciously with me to Manhattan. I took him out. He was a young adult, lived in Manhattan. He was Fry. And I took him as a sweet boy. Hello? We back? Okay. I took him out, and I could not work out what the trauma was. One. All the rest, if we tune in and we listen, we hear what it was eventually. Eventually it comes out. And then the healing can happen. And I submit to you, until they know that we know, we, the parents, know and accept it, and we stop nitpicking them. But instead, when you walk into that room, if it happens to you on Shabbos and the kid's smoking pot, you go over to them, give them a hug, and say, "You must be in so much pain, Shefela. I feel so bad. Is there anything I can do? Is there anything I can do, Shefela?" And by the way, I'm so grateful that when you need to do this, you don't do it in the living room, with the other kids. But you do it here. That's very sensitive of you. It's very sensitive. Thank you. Do you understand? We walk in and see the symptoms, interpret the symptoms, and we enter into the symptom to reach their heart. That's crisis chinuch. Instead of constantly trying to fix the symptoms. Their symptoms, their behavior, the externalizing is just the symptoms of internal pain, like anger. What is anger? Anger is externalized pain. Someone gets angry with you. How helpful is it to get angry back? Not at all. But someone gets angry with you, and you reach inside and say, "You must be upset about something and hurting. And maybe it's to do with me. Tell me what's bothering you. Tell me how I've offended you." And the more you do that, the anger goes away. Because the pain is attended to. The fact that we don't understand this, and most of us are not ready for it, we're not geared, we weren't taught that that's what you're meant to do. Years ago, I had a lady, and this kid was so frequently at death's door with drugs that Southfield pekuach nefesh, it was real pekuach nefesh with him. And one Pesach, she walked into his room, and she found on Pesach in his room a fresh McDonald's burger sandwich. Tarfus, chametz, the works. She called me up crying. I thought he had died. I'll be honest, she was hysterical on the phone. She couldn't breathe. She called me up. I thought he died. And it turned out she found this McDonald's sandwich in his room on Pesach. She said, "What should I do?" She's crying. I told her, "This is the greatest moment in your life. You've been waiting. This is the moment you've been waiting for. You go give him a hug. And you say, if that's what it takes for your pain, then I'm ashamed I didn't buy it for you. If I could have, I would have." And you give him a hug. And your kid starts to heal and he cries. That kid, by the way, is still not from really yet. He's on the way, but he's married with 2 kids, settled and healthy. And has a great relationship with his parents, by the way, today. And he was at death's door, I can't tell you how many times. Drug ODs. You give them a hug and you say, gosh, if that's what you need for your pain, that's what you need, of course. On the assumption that your Rav has paskened with you that it's Southfield Pikuach Nefesh. Okay? I just want to remind us all as we go forward, that's what we're talking about. That's the case we're talking about. What time are we breaking for lunch? Okay, tomorrow? Okay. No, I think not. What, 28? I'm going to go a bit further. Let's do a little bit. Can we go further a little bit? I'd like to cover a little bit more. Is that okay before we break? Yes, is that okay? Great. So what's the science behind trauma? See, for me, neuroscience, when we got into the sugya of neuroscience and we began to understand the actual science behind trauma, I train all the parents I work with in what I'm doing with you right now. Because I find that when we have the science of neuroscience about trauma, it takes us to a different place about the interventions that now make perfect sense of what we're being asked to do, because we're trauma treatment. Your home is a trauma treatment center when you know this. So what is PTSD? Remember, what we're dealing with is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That disorder in which your child will have a severe psychological reaction, they'll freak out, an exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the original trauma. And you have to realize that we as parents are an external cue that symbolizes, not just resembles, we're it. So we can actually activate our kids into a trauma place at any moment just by our existence. Calling upstairs saying, come quickly, I'm lighting. You know, everything we do can trigger our kids. So we have to understand the science of it so that we know what it is we're treating. So the culprit here is a God-given gift called the amygdala. The amygdala is this tiny little piece you can see on the sketch in the middle of the brain, in the limbic system. And the purpose of the amygdala is to scan the body 4 times a second, according to the experts. For a normal, healthy person, for a trauma victim, it can be 100 times a second. But a regular person, the amygdala scans all your senses: touch, sight, sound, taste, hearing. It scans everything, listening for any sounds that could be threatening, smells, anything that could tell you there's danger around. And it's constantly scanning your body. That's the purpose of the amygdala. That's what it does. So its purpose is to protect us. That's its job. It makes sure we're safe because it's constantly listening for danger. So again, if we're going to come to a little later, but if we can accept for the moment the premise that, and I'll explain this in detail a little later, that a child, just like that girl that plunged that cigarette into her hand to free her from pain, does that make sense? We got that picture? So everything they're doing is not a philosophical choice. It's not like they worked through comparative religion and they went through 3 courses and decided that, they don't really believe in Shabbos, they don't really hold by it. It is nothing to do with that whatsoever. It's a very simple thing. I need to distract myself from my pain right now. And if the only way I can distract myself from my pain is on my smartphone, then I need my smartphone right now. It's my painkiller. Does that make sense? Well, the amygdala, that was interesting. The amygdala picks up everything going on around us, scanning for whatever it is that could be taking me to a place where I'm not safe. The bear in the woods example is the best. If you're on a Cholamoid trip in the woods, you go into some park and you take your kids and you put out a blanket and a picnic and you're having a marvelous time Cholamoid. And about 100 yards away from you, you see a small bear comes out of the brush, out of the bushes. Now what do? Well, let me tell you what you don't do. You don't say, oh, look, isn't that cute? Look, does everyone see the bear? You don't start taking selfies with the bear, on your smartphone. You don't sit there glaring. Now, I heard it's only the black ones that kill you, but the brown ones don't. Or is it the brown ones do and the black ones? You don't do any of this. The amygdala shuts you down and says all that happens is, get in the car. Everyone, step back, get in the car. And you leave everything and you get in your car. The amygdala shuts all other processes down, including the interest in, is that cute bear, or do I want to take a picture with it, or is it really dangerous, not dangerous? You understand? It shuts everything down. Essentially, does this make sense? The amygdala's job is to make you irrational. You're not rational at that moment. You're in survival mode. You go into survival mode. That's the bear in the woods. What it does, it converts then in PTSD a previous threat to a future threat. So the amygdala, when you've gone through any form of trauma, the amygdala senses something that looks like, feels like, sounds like, could be that thing that happened back then 10 years ago, and makes you react right now as if it's happening. That's what PTSD is. That's what it does. That's why the treatment for it is that separation, where you learn to separate, that it's not happening now, even though it sounds, feels like it, looks like it, but it's actually not happening right now. The amygdala has the ability to shut down. That means it impairs the functioning of your prefrontal cortex. I'm sorry if I'm being too technical, but I can tell you that all my clients tell me this piece of what I'm explaining now is the game changer. What I'm about to show you is the game changer in the whole sugya. Because look at this picture. The executive states, you see the dark green area, that's the executive states of the brain. We're going to see in a moment what that does. The amygdala has the power to either shut it down. I think of it as a dial, not as a switch. But it dials it down and takes you what we call offline. And if you look at the next picture, this captures it all. This captures it all. Look what the prefront, you have in your books. This is really important to memorize and know this, because it just changes. It's a game changer when you talk to your child. When the amygdala triggers in your child, and your child feels threatened by something around them that reminds them of whatever learning. It could be sitting at the Shabbos table singing Zmiris, and they remember the horrible experience being forced to sing Zmiris at the Shabbos table as if they're a frum, healthy, nice Jew, when all they want to do is go upstairs and touch themselves inappropriately because they're a sexual abuse victim. You understand, they're dealing with such deep, complicated, confusing stuff that all has to come out eventually in terms of treatment for them to be healed. But meanwhile, they're sitting there being triggered. Guess which bit shuts down? The prefrontal cortex. Well, take a look at the qualities that get shut. Think of your child when they're having a bad reaction, a freak out. Think about this. Think about them, rather, when we read this list. Because look at the list. These are the things shut down. Empathy. No, they don't want to help you clear the table and take out your own stupid garbage. Who, I'm a slave around here? That's why you have me? Oh, you gave birth to me so you have servants. Very nice. Empathy's out. Insight. Don't you see, if you dress like that and you walk out, I heard enough, Mommy, leave me alone. You're blaming me? They have no insight. That's shut down. You ask them, if you walk around dressed like that, you're going to get into trouble. But there is no insight when the prefrontal cortex is shut down, or lack of insight. They're in survival mode. They just want to survive. Response flexibility. Do you think you could let your brother play with the Lego first? That's response flexibility. Do you think you could let someone else sit in this seat? No, they have to sit in a certain seat at the table, and they will not be budged. Why? It probably connects somewhere to something that's to do with their trauma. They have no flexibility. And to you it's just a seat. And you give them a whole musadrasha about chesed, kindness. And the kid's in a trauma state, shut down with the prefrontal cortex offline. Emotional regulation. Well, can't you just talk to me nicely when you're freaking out? Can you speak respectfully? It's kibbutov. I mean, you may be off the derech, but kibbutov. Kibbutov. There's a way to speak. There's a way to speak. I mean, it's crazy. When you think about it, there's no emotional regulation if the prefrontal cortex is shut down. Yeah, they're going to scream, why do you have to use curse words? You need to use curse words in my house? Well, if emotional regulation is shut down, they're going to use curse words. You can't stop that. And even if you reason with them when they're not in a trauma state, if that ever happens, because the very act of reasoning with them puts them into a trauma state for most kids. But Lu Yitzu, you could actually reason with them. When they're triggered next time, that part of the brain just went offline. So now you tell them, but didn't we discuss this? It's crazy. You're laughing because it's completely crazy what we do to them. It's completely mad. Body regulation. Kicking his brother. Nechte getug. He's going to kick his brother. Get between them. Morality. Morality. Okay, so you're off the derech, but you don't have to be immoral the way you behave. No, even a guy doesn't act like that. Right? All these choice quotes. We should have a book of choice quotes, what never to say to your kid. But if the prefrontal cortex is shut down, then morality goes with it. So no, he's not connected to morality because he's in survival mode. He's in the survival place. Intuition. Oh, here's the big one. Attuned communication. Attuned communication. Can't you just, like Schaefer, can't we just talk it over? Can we have a call? Could you please answer one thing? I'm asking you a question. And all you get is a curse word back in your face. Attuned communication? Yeah, I really feel for you that you don't have enough servants to help you make Shabbos. And fear modulation also gets shut down because you don't want to modulate fear when you're in a frightening trauma state. You want to get out of there. You don't want to be able to tolerate the bear coming out the woodwork, out the undergrowth, the bushes. You don't want to modulate that fear. You want to get in your car. So that gets shut down too. Now imagine what's going to happen when you engage your kid and talk to them, and the amygdala has triggered them, and these 9 qualities are offline. This is called offline. They don't have sufficient access. I don't think of it as necessarily as a switch on-off, and each one can be different. But I do think of it as a dial, where it's severely dialed down, and if you keep pushing at that moment, you will then flip the switch. You'll then turn it off completely. Therefore, they can't think straight. Does that make sense? You ask them, they make irrational choices and decisions. They go out without a coat in the freezing night. At 3 o'clock they'll go, and then they're not coming back till 6 in the morning. They make irrational decisions because The prefrontal cortex is offline. And that's why all the interventions that we developed for crisis chinuch to help our kids come back is to put them back online. That's the point of crisis chinuch. It takes a child that's disconnected because they feel terrified of life, they feel frightened, they need to fight and flight or freeze, they need to run away. And by doing the interventions we have, we bring them back online, and then they can have access to these 9 qualities of the prefrontal cortex. And guess what? They can do quite a good job of getting their lives together. Our job is to create safety in their lives where they want to be close to us, feel safe with us, and safe around us. And guess what? When you walk into your child's room on Shabbos and you find them smoking and you give them a hug at that moment and say, wow, you must be in so much pain. I'm sorry I didn't understand this before. You create safety. You bring them back online. And when you walk in and give them a Musa drasha, not in my house, not in my house, there are limits. There are limits what we can accept in our house. I understand you're struggling, but there are limits. You just push them completely off, shut down the prefrontal cortex, and you absolutely are guaranteed to get something so hurtful and crazy out of their mouth, because at that moment, you've triggered them into a survival mode. You're the bear coming out the brush. You're that bear. And the one place they don't want to be is near you. You're the bear. And their amygdala will shut down the prefrontal cortex, and they're gone. And we were at fault. But when we walk in dafka, when we see them doing whatever they're doing that's inappropriate and wrong, la halacha, for example, and we embrace them and understand them that you're doing this because you're trying to cover up your pain. You're trying to deal with your pain. You're trying to live with your pain. And they see we get it, and you cry with them and feel with them. You put them back online. And that is the only way they can make good choices. Do you understand? It's the direct facilitator that causes recovery. And without it, it's actually the best opportunity. You begin to understand this over the years as you get deeper in this sugya. It's amazing how those are the moments you want to look forward to. When we were, my wife and I, going through this, I was in Svat with our 14-year-old, 15-year-old. How old was she then? 15, 16? Something like that. And I'd been in Svat with her. I thought, we'd had this big miracle in Svat. We had this great Shabbos. But on the way out, the heavy metal music was back up. The clothing was chaloshes again. And there we were driving out. I went Derech HaBikah in the old days through the valley. And by the time I got to Bet Shan, I was in so much pain. I couldn't live. I was dying. This was the early days. This is 26 years ago? 25 years ago? About 25 years ago. I was in so much pain, I didn't know what to do with myself. I pulled into, there was a convenience store, gas station in Bet Shan, and I pulled in there. I left her in the car with her heavy metal rock music, and I got out and I walked into the Jordan Valley. I was just gone. I couldn't cope. And I walked into the Jordan Valley and I cried heavy. And I called out to Hashem, help me, tell me something. Tell me something that I can hang on to. I'm lost. And these words came into my head that were so amazing. It was a gift. And I immediately understood what it meant. It was so profound, and it was the beginning of crisis chinuch at that moment in the Beit Shan Valley. And the words came into my head. Defy me more than I can love you. Try it. You're going to fail. Those are the words that came into my head. That I knew that her defiance would allow me to help her heal. Because if I could love her more powerfully than she could defy me, then I would make her feel safe. And she'd have a chance to heal. It's what crisis chinuch is predicated on. It's those moments, those crazy moments, when they're doing what they're doing, which we think is defiance, but they're trying to survive, they're trying to live, they're in so much pain, they're trying to live. And if we can reach into that moment and love them more deeply than they can defy us, then we create the safety with which perhaps they can heal. That's crisis chinuch. That's the heart of it. Okay. So, when the prefrontal cortex gets shut down, the only option we have is to help create safety for them by embracing them in their pain. We don't approve of it. Okay, there's a halachic nuance that's obvious. You can't say to your kid, go smoke in your room. You can't tell them an instruction to do a chilul Shabbos. But you certainly can go in and embrace them and reflect back to them, I understand you're in pain, and I'm so embarrassed, I'm so ashamed that I couldn't protect you from it. I'm so sorry. You focus on the pain. Do you understand? You exploit the moment. You take that moment when they're doing something that seems to be so defiant and off, and you exploit that moment to show them love and caring. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd been there for you. I wish I'd seen then what I see now, what I'm learning now. And we create safety. And if we go in and give them a drasha, instructions about what they can and can't do, we set limits. You know, old-fashioned social work. Let's set limits. Let's get a contract. Let's contract with them. For this sugya, that's completely absurd. It's cruel. It's destructive. It's dangerous. Contracts are great for regular kids. You know, regular struggling kids, okay, you help them in a kind way. It may still work for that. It definitely doesn't work for this, and it's definitely destructive. It's the exact opposite we do. We reach through the behavior into their hearts so that we can help them heal, knowing the prefrontal cortex is offline. Look at this. Look at this next slide. The healthy brain, the front, that's the prefrontal cortex. Do you see the red on the front? That's a healthy brain. Take a look at PTSD, what it looks like in the brain. That's what an MRI of PTSD looks like. If you ever, the phrase, when I first saw this slide, you know what phrase came to my mind? They're all over the place. Look at the red. It's taka all over the place. The prefrontal cortex has a little, but it's really not where it's at. That's not where the energy in the brain is. Look at this one. The top is a healthy brain. Again, the prefrontal cortex is red, lit up well. Look at the abused brain. And guess which part on the abused brain is lit up the most? That's the survival. That's the part, the brain stem. That's survival. There's no one home in that abused brain to have a conversation with, to explain stuff. All those 9 qualities are shut down. Are we crazy that we go in then to try and explain to them? Just tell them. Just explain to them. Let them know. It's destructive and dangerous to do that to a kid when in this state. Because this part's offline. You will precipitate worse behavior. You will cause them to do more smoking up and more dangerous stuff or more cursing of you. You will push them wrong because they're already in fight and flight. They're already terrified. So now just try to imagine how cruel it is to expect them to just get over it. Just get over it. I mean, it's so crazy. The trauma is there, the imprint is there, and they haven't even begun healing yet. And it's our job to facilitate and create the environment for that healing to occur.